Well, thank you, and good afternoon, brethren. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Mr. Pyle was correct. I am serving as the regional pastor in the south central portion of the United States, which takes in basically the states of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, a little portion there along the Gulf Coast of stretching into portions of Alabama and Florida down there on the Gulf Coast portion, and even a little slice of Tennessee up around the Memphis area. I for the last year have been there in East Texas, living in Kilgore, Texas, and directly serving congregations in Dallas and Gladewater, as well as over in Arkansas on a regular basis as well, and then gradually traveling through the course of the year through the other area. I might just mention that we have about 1,000 brethren attending services in the south central portion of the United States. That involves 32 congregations, video groups. There are a number of other full-time ministers and elders who are not in the employ of the church who serve these brethren. All of the things that we do in God's work involves the collaborative effort of so many, all the things that go on here at headquarters, and it's always a pleasure to be out here and to see the work and the effort and the dedication on the part of those who serve here at headquarters. And I want to bring you greetings from the brethren back in the South, back in Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma. We really appreciate the efforts that go into that. It's been exciting, I would say, as I've told several out here, that we have had in the last few, I would say, couple of months. I have seen more new prospective member activity than we have had, frankly, in the entire period that I have served in the global ministry. It's been very exciting, and visiting new people, and they're zealous when they get up at when they purposely set their alarm clock to get up at 4:30 in the morning so they can be in there prepared not to miss a telecast. And I just visited a couple in Arkansas just very recently, and they were all excited because they had found the truth of God, and I didn't want to miss anything, and others as well. I've been, I guess, getting probably about 1 or 2 visit requests a week for the last I would say 6 weeks to 2 months is probably averaged out that way. Some weeks may be 3 and then skip a week and get a couple of more. But anyway, it is exciting to be a part of that. I, of course, have been out here for the Council of Elders meetings, and Dr. Meredith had asked me to stay over and be here with you for Sabbath services. I got to looking back, I think it's been about 2.5 years since I've been here with you for Sabbath services. We've been out here for a number of times in between, but it's always great to be back here at headquarters and to have a chance to visit with all of you. Brethren, I think as we all understand, we are in a time in the course of world events when a lot is transpiring on the world scene. We have gone through some remarkable times in recent years. We saw a matter of a few years ago, in fact, in the fall festival, we're coming into the fall festival season. The fall festival season of 1989 is perhaps the most memorable fall festival season for any of us, I think, in our time in the church, if we're going to look at events that had to do with the ultimate fulfillment of these festivals. If you remember back to the summer and fall of 1989, what transpired was simply the passing from the scene of the entire post-World War II order. People thought that the Iron Curtain seemed about as permanently in place as anything that could be imagined. The United States and Britain particularly had, in the course of the years since the end of World War II, spent literally billions of dollars in intelligence gathering operations. We had spies, we had counter spies, we had great bureaus of individuals who were analyzing intelligence reports, reading foreign language newspapers, we had our listening posts, we had all of our intelligence gathering apparatus year after year after year. And yet, brethren, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Iron Curtain, came as a total shock and surprise to all of the so-called experts. They had not foreseen these things. Now, you know, the Scripture tells us that the time is coming when a power will arise in Europe, which will be the final resurrection of the old Holy Roman Empire. And we're told that all the world will wonder after the beast. They will be shocked. They will be amazed at what happens. I remember sitting in a motel room in Biloxi, Mississippi, during the course of the Feast of Tabernacles and watching on a television set individuals pouring across through the Brandenburg Gate there in Berlin, coming from East Berlin, dancing along the walls, and all of the rejoicing, all of the excitement. And the news commentators were stunned. They were interviewing various ones, and I remember one particular individual who was there very, he was assuring everyone that this certainly did not mean that the reunification of Germany, let's not be jumping to conclusions. This was something that, if it would occur at all, would be in the distant future. An individual who was sought out and analyzed because he was supposed to be an expert. His opinion was right there on network television because he was a man in the know. Well, he didn't know very much, did he? He didn't understand the times in which he was living. We are right now, we saw this situation occur on the world scene. We saw this breakup, this collapse. How many of us, how many people in this country who remember the 50s and the 60s and the Cold War and all of these things, how many people could have imagined that the time would come when the hammer and sickle would be peacefully lowered from atop the Kremlin? People would have said, that is impossible. Such a thing could have never happened. That's what it would have seemed. Brethren, God has a plan. God has a time plan, and God is right on schedule. Now, we have seen these events that have taken place. We saw the post-World War II order swept from the scene. Now, we see something else on the world scene today. We see that we are entering into a period that, number one, we have economic instability. I don't think that comes as a shock to any of you. We have seen the situation beginning in Asia and spreading across the world of the instability in the world stock markets. We see that there is a very nervous feeling in the financial markets, and they are very nervously reacting. The experts don't know exactly what's going to happen, and they certainly don't know when it's going to happen. We find the economic prosperity of this nation and nations around the world. The economic prosperity is threatened, and people are nervous. And we see this volatile stock market. We see the market go up, and then immediately there's profit taking, and people get nervous. Some news incident happens, and here, several hundred points can drop away in just a matter of a day or two. This volatile situation, and it's not limited to simply one country. So we find ourselves in looking at it from the standpoint of the whole world, around the world. We look at this time of economic instability and nervousness, and yet at the same time we are entering a period of weak governments. The United States government is becoming virtually paralyzed and will be more so. President Clinton is, of course, dealing with his own problems and his own political problems. We are, of course, in an election period, the congressional elections of November. There are many things in terms of the internal workings of this country that are diverting the top leadership's attention to other things. And in the aftermath of this election, the congressional election of November, things are going to speed up as far as jockeying for position for the presidential election of 2000. This nation's government is going to become increasingly paralyzed and unable to act in terms of what is transpiring on the world scene. Russia has a weak government. Now, President Yeltsin has finally submitted a nominee for prime minister who was confirmed by the Russian parliament. But Russia is weakened, and they have a weak government. Germany has elections taking place that will occur during the fall festival season. And I think it's particularly of note that we look in terms of the German elections, because there is a very significant matter that we ought to take note of. The present Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, came to power back in 1982. In fact, for those of you who remember, it was on the evening that began the Feast of Trumpets in 1982 that a no-confidence vote was held in the Bundestag in West Germany, and the West German government that was in power was forced to resign. It was exactly 2 weeks later, on the evening that began the Feast of Tabernacles in 1982, that the government of Helmut Kohl, the Christian Democrats, came to power. Now, Chancellor Kohl has presided over a remarkable period of German history. He has played a very significant role in terms of the collapse of the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, the establishment of a pan-European currency, the euro, which is going into effect in the immediate future. Now, there's something significant about that date, the Feast of Trumpets of 1982, for those of you who like to play with numbers. That was a very significant anniversary. Because if you want to go back to the book of Daniel, chapters 4 and 5, Daniel chapter 5 in particular, we read of an event that occurred. An event that we learn from history occurred on the Feast of Trumpets in 539 BC. That event that occurred, recorded there in Daniel chapter 5, was a vision of handwriting on the wall. And Belshazzar, who was having this drunken banquet, and they were toasting the gods of gold and silver and iron and brass and wood. And I suspect by the time they had worked their way down to the gods of wood, they were, pretty well lubricated. Belshazzar got instant sobriety that night because he saw a hand appear out of nowhere and began to write in fiery letters on the wall. And we're told that the joints of his loins smote. And if you want to look up and see the meaning of that euphemism, you will find that he was very frightened indeed. He, in the aftermath of that, wanted to know what to do. And he called for Daniel, the prophet. Daniel, the one who had served his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel came in and he interpreted the handwriting on the wall. And that very night, great Babylon fell. The Medes and the Persians came through the gates that very night. Belshazzar died. And we began the progression that is described in prophecy, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, going to other places. Now, Daniel 4 provides a backdrop. It talks about the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, seeing this great tree that represented him and his empire, seeing it cut down, and yet the stump banded with iron. And we find that ultimately life would be given to the roots and the tree would grow once again. But 7 times were to pass over. Now it's interesting, we're familiar with 7 times in Bible prophecy. Time, times and a half a time, identified in Bible prophecy, 1,260 years. 7 times, 2,520 years. Any of you who like math, you might just take 539 BC, the Feast of Trumpets, and come forward 2,520 years. Don't forget to make the correction of 1 year going from BC to AD. And you find out, when you do that you come out to the Feast of Trumpets 1982. Now, significant events have occurred on the world scene since that time. A stage was set. 7 years later, in the fall festival season of 1989, it was time for the wall to collapse. The Iron Curtain, seemingly forever there to make a demarcation of Europe into East and West. But you see, Bible prophecy had foretold something. Foretold a lot of things. But in Daniel chapter 2, you remember the account, Nebuchadnezzar in a vision, in a dream, saw a great image. And the image had a head of gold and shoulders of silver, and it had the thighs of brass, and it had legs of iron. 2 legs. Those legs culminated in 2 feet. 2 feet, 10 toes. The feet were composed of a combination of iron and miry clay. And then in the vision, a stone cut out without hands, a stone of supernatural origin, came down from heaven and smashed the image on its toes. And when it did, the entire image turned to dust and blew away. And the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And we're told that in the days of those final kings, those final 10 kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. Daniel chapter 2, end of the chapter. Now, we have understood through the years, and we have publications dealing with it, Daniel explained to Nebuchadnezzar that he represented that head of gold, the Babylonian Empire. We know that that was followed by the empire of the Medes and the Persians. The third empire was the Greco-Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great. Finally, the Roman Empire. And of course, the Roman Empire came down after the days of Constantine, aptly pictured as 2 legs, because the Eastern Roman Empire, in the days of Constantine and after, was divided into the Eastern Roman Empire with the capital at Constantinople, or the ancient city of Byzantium. It was known as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. And, of course, the Western Roman Empire with the capital at Rome. And we've understood that over the years and commented upon it. But you know, the implication of that is that when you come down to the final 10 toes, when you come down to the 2 feet, you're looking at the successors of both the eastern and the western legs that comprise those final 10 kings. Now, the stage was set for that in a way that we could not have fully imagined. We saw some of these things, and yet, in terms of realizing how could that be? And yet, when God's time came, now we find on the world scene that we're in a period of entering a period of increasingly weak and unstable governments. We face that in the United States, which is going to increasingly create a vacuum on the world scene. We certainly see that in Russia right now. I think we're going to find the same thing in Germany. A matter of a weakened government. It appears that Chancellor Kohl will not win re-election. That, according to all of the polls, that appears to be the way things are going. We're going to see increasingly weak governments. Now, what happens when you have weak governments? They are unable to deal with problems. They are unable to cope with problems. And so what happens? Those problems grow. Those problems become increasingly serious. And they develop into crisis. Weakness and instability sets the stage for crisis. And crisis sets the stage for something radical. For revolutions, dictatorships arise out of periods of crisis. They don't arise out of periods of economic stability and strength. They don't arise when people feel secure and comfortable. They arise when people become frightened. When people are scared of what's going to happen. When the beast appears on the world scene, this final resurrection of the old Holy Roman Empire. When this individual appears on the world scene, he's not going to show up with a little sign around his neck saying, "I'm the beast and I'm here to oppress you." He's going to appear as a Savior. He's going to appear as the man of the hour. The individual who's the only hope of saving civilization. The individual who holds out a hope of prosperity and stability in a world that is in a tailspin out of which it cannot come. You look back at history. It was out of the chaos of the French Revolution that Napoleon came. It was out of the chaos in the aftermath of World War I. It was out of that chaos, out of that instability, that men like Mussolini and Hitler rose to power, who would have never been voted in during good times. So, brethren, we are entering a time that is going to set the stage for the events that we read of in the Bible. Now, we don't know exactly how long some of these particular stages are going to last. But I think anyone who cannot look at the signs of the times in which we live and perceive that these are the days of which Jesus Christ spoke must be blind indeed. So the stage is being set for a time of deepening crisis. A time of deepening crisis out of which eventually will arise one who purports to be a Savior. Now, it's interesting because, to all intents and purposes, it will appear that he is right. Sometimes we have not focused on this part, but if you go back to Revelation 18, Revelation 18 describes Babylon from the standpoint, the timing standpoint of the events right around the time of Christ's return. And it looks back on something that's ending. But what we find in Revelation 18 is the description here of Babylon the Great, and the timing is the fall of Babylon the Great, Revelation 18, verse 2. Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. But notice what we're told of her, this great city Babylon, this mighty city, as it's called in verse 10. Verse 11 says, "The merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore." This is a great trading economic combine. It has brought for a while what seemingly was universal prosperity. And so we find in verse 15 that the merchants of these things were made rich by her. That's prosperity. That's prosperity. Out of the midst of chaos, out of the midst of a financial debacle, out of the midst of currency collapse, there is seemingly an economic miracle that takes place. Things aren't just going to go from bad to worse from now until the kingdom comes. Oh yes, that is the overall result, and we understand here in Revelation 18 what's going to happen. Babylon the Great is going to fall. When 1 hour is her judgment going to come. When God's time comes, this system will collapse. And it describes here, then 1 hour, verse 17, "So great riches has come to naught." And it describes the setting. But the reason there's going to be so much lament is because people have gotten rich as a part of this system, and they are seeing their world collapse around them. Now, Revelation 18, if you want to go through, it's sort of interesting to make a study of it, that you will find in the course of Revelation 18 that Ezekiel chapter 27 is referenced a number of times. I have a center reference margin in my Bible, and just perusing it, I look down and see about 7 times just right off that the center reference margin refers back to Ezekiel 27 from Revelation 18. Now, the reason it does is because these are parallel chapters. Now, Ezekiel 27 addresses the same subject, but it addresses it under a different name. It addresses it under the name of the ancient city of Tyre, the great commercial capital. Just as Babylon was the religious and the military center, just as Assyria was famous, Babylon was religious and political, Assyria was noted for its military prowess. Tyre was considered a center of commerce. This final system, called in the Scriptures Babylon the Great, because ultimately all of it stems from Babylon, but there are prophecies in the Old Testament that all tie in. And you see, John, in the book of Revelation, we're told in Revelation 1 that he bore witness of three things: of the testimony of Jesus Christ, of the Word of God, and of the things which he saw. You could not understand the prophecies of the Old Testament in chronological framework if you didn't have the book of Revelation. And you really couldn't understand the book of Revelation without the keys Jesus Christ gave in the Olivet prophecy. The testimony of Jesus Christ would certainly refer to the things Jesus himself said, Olivet prophecy being a key. And then you find even throughout the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ is actually quoted first person. We have his direct testimony, which the book of Revelation tells us is the spirit of prophecy. It's what energizes and enlivens and provides the spirit of all prophecy. But John also testified of the Word of God. Now, the Word of God in his day and during his lifetime had primarily consisted of the Old Testament Scriptures. You find in the book of Revelation there are many quotations and paraphrases from the Old Testament Scriptures, particularly from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, some of the minor prophets. You see, John takes excerpts from these prophets and he weaves it into the story flow of Revelation. And so then we can go back and turn to some of these chapters in the Old Testament and we know where they fit. If you didn't have Revelation, there's so many things you wouldn't know. John also saw direct visions, which he records. So he records Christ's testimony. He records portions of the already written Word of God, which he brings into the framework in their proper order. And he also records visions that he saw. And part of what he wove into this framework were the statements from Ezekiel 27, which are given under the guise of Tyre, but John quotes them in Revelation 18 as applying to Babylon the Great. Now we notice in Revelation, or in Ezekiel 27, we have a listing of countries that are involved in this great economic combine. And what we find from a very quick glance at Ezekiel 27 is it has economic implications that are worldwide. They go all over. We find nations here in Ezekiel 27. It starts out, it talks about in verse 7, it talks about Egypt. It talks about, on down the latter part of the verse, the Isles of Elisha, which refers to the Hellenic Isles, or what we term Greece today. Coming on down in verse 10, it talks about individuals recruited for the army. It talks about Persia. Verse 12, Tarshish was your merchant. 13, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach were your merchants. We have traditionally understood, historically, Tubal and Meshach to refer to the two branches of the great Russian peoples. In fact, the word Moscow is derived from Meshach. We don't need to get into the historical tracking on that. We come on down. Syria is mentioned verse 16. Verse 17, Judah and the land of Israel were your merchants. And talks about the wheat market. Comes on down verse 19, Dan and Javan. Comes on down to some of the African nations that are mentioned. In Sheba, mentioned on down in verse 22. It mentions Arabia in 21. Mentions Asher in verse 23. It talks about what initially has worldwide economic ties. Now we understand that the power that is going to arise in Europe is a European power, is 10 kings, 10 governments, that will be the successor, the final successor of the Roman Empire. We understand that this worldwide cooperation, as it were, is going to break down. We understand that the beast power is going to take actions against Judah and Israel. We understand these things, but we see a stage being set in Ezekiel 27 is there is a prelude of world prosperity. There is something that begins to come on the scene. A period of economic salvation is what it's going to appear to be. Babylon the Great is an economic as well as military and political and religious combine. And you see, false religion is going to play a strategic role. Now, as these things shape up, and all of these events begin to take place, there is going to be brought great pressure for people to conform and to fit in with this system. If you want to look up, we want to do a little word study sometime, you might look up the origin of the word tribulation. You find that it goes back, the root of it refers to a press. They had like a wine press where they put the grapes, and they had a way of, sort of screwing down the lid. Olives the same way. And it would eventually, you see, put pressure, increasing pressure, until all the juice was squeezed out. Now, the term for tribulation comes from that. The sense of it is pressure. There is coming a time of increasing pressure. We have gone through times of great pressure in the world, but there is coming a time of greater pressure than has ever been brought to bear. Now, that will undoubtedly be because of the magnitude of the scope, because there are times of pressure that have been as intense as we can imagine, that have been brought on particular groups of people at particular times. But there is a time of pressure coming that will be worldwide in its implications. It will have, or at least will have, a magnitude that will far surpass the limited times of intense persecution against specific ones. This is, of course, the time that's called a time of Jacob's trouble. Now, in the context of all of this increasing pressure, people are going to be confronted with choices. We live in a society today where people don't like to take responsibility for their choices. The popular thing is for people to say, well, I was a victim. Now, the essence of being a victim is you don't have a choice. And people like to portray themselves somehow as not having a choice. But we have choices because God has given us the right to choose as human beings. We must choose, and we must take responsibility for our choices. Now, it's interesting. Let's just notice a couple of things briefly in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 6, we go through the opening of the seals that are described here in the book of Revelation. I won't go through the details of that, but we find that when the sixth seal is opened, in verse 12, we find that there are tremendous signs in the heavens that occur, and we're told in verse 17, for the great day of His wrath is come. So we're now at the stage that we term the day of the Lord. The time when God is prepared to step in, and the judgment of God is going to come. Now, we can see, beginning in chapter 8, as the seventh seal is opened, that the things that God begins to do, and the trumpets that began to blow, and all of the things that began to occur. There is an event that occurs between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 8, and that we find in chapter 7, verse 1. After these things, I saw four angels. After these events, these seals had been opened, after the time when God was preparing to step in, I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, and another angel, verse 2, had the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to this angel, saying, these angels in verse 3, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God in their forehead. And I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. And so John sees this and records it here in Revelation. And then in verse 9, he sees another vision, a contrast with this. He sees now something on into the future, much further. Verse 9, after this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues. Now, John had just seen a group that had a definitive number, 144,000 of the tribes of Israel. Now he sees a multitude which no man could number, and this comes from all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues. So he sees a contrast. The timing of these visions is different. One is right here in the flow of things after the events here, the prophetic events leading up to the seals. Well, what's the timing of this that John sees here in verse 9? Well, you see, these are individuals standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And we find that here are individuals who are standing before God. We're looking at events after the resurrection. In fact, we find that they're before the throne of God, verse 15, that in the end of verse 15, He that sits on the throne shall dwell among them. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. Verse 17, the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them and lead them unto living fountains of water, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Now, these statements are quoted back in Revelation 21. You see, we find individuals who made a choice, and we find the ultimate result of their choice. They made a choice when the results were not so obvious. They had to make a choice by faith. Now, the result of their choice is they're going to stand before God. We find a whole group of people described here who will no longer suffer nor experience pain, but who will be in the presence of God and of Christ. But you know, they made choices long before that time. Now let's come on back a little further and we'll begin to tie some of this together. We find this group mentioned, this group of 144,000 mentioned in Revelation 14. Timing is a later time, and the mention here in Revelation 14 is significantly later in the flow of things than the beginning of the trumpet plagues. This is a time after the resurrection, because John says, I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his Father's name in their foreheads. Now, I just want to stop there, and let's go back. This represents a contrast. Let's go back about 3 verses, because often because of chapter breaks, we don't notice the flow of something. Let's go back 3 verses to Revelation 13:16. We notice at an earlier time, because the events of Revelation 14 are picturing a time when individuals are standing with Christ, and it's not exactly at the second coming, because Christ will stand on the Mount of Olives when He returns, but this is on Mount Zion. Mount Zion was the location of the throne of David. Here we find the establishment of the government of God. We find a group of individuals standing here described as having the Father's name in their forehead. Now, if you go back 3 verses, we come to a time when the beast power holds sway, a time that is described 3 verses earlier. The beast power is holding sway. And there is a religious aspect, because you see, the Roman Empire had not only a civil successor, it had a religious successor, described in Revelation 13:11 as another creature which came up that had 2 horns like a lamb, but spoke as a dragon. It outwardly had the appearance of a lamb. It claimed and appeared to be the representative of Jesus Christ. But in reality, that great dragon was the real motivating force. This creature, this false religious system, exercised, Revelation 13:12, the power of the first beast, the old Roman Empire. And it caused people to worship, to give loyalty and allegiance and devotion to the empire. It exercised power, verse 13, it did great wonders. Deceived, verse 14, religious deception was practiced by this system, so that people all over the earth were deceived because they saw these miracles. Jesus spoke in Matthew 24 of false prophets that would work miracles so impressive that if it were possible it would deceive the very elect. And so we see that. And then we find in verse 15, this system caused, the end of the verse, caused as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Verse 16, caused all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand and or in their foreheads. Now here we find a mark received in their foreheads. This contrasts with a group of people that are mentioned just 3 verses later as having something else in their forehead. There are those who receive, and you talk about pressure. we find that no man, verse 17, might buy or sell except he had the mark. So we find ourselves in a time of increasingly weak, unstable governments. Governments unable to respond on the world scene to the events that are occurring. These events will escalate and increasing crisis will occur. Ultimately, out of this period of crisis will come the final resurrection of the old Babylonian Roman system. There will be economic implications. There will also be religious implications, and the religious power here is going to support the political, economic, military power, and is going to insist that people give allegiance and devotion. Is going to insist that there be a symbol of conformity, because you see, this economic system is going to insist on certain things. And so we find that there is going to be tremendous pressure brought to bear, because everyone wants to buy and sell. Everyone wants to survive. And pressure is going to be brought to bear. And there are going to be those who say, well, I didn't have a choice. I had to go along. And they accept into their foreheads, into their intellect, into their mind, what is in effect a brand of disobedience to God. But you see, while certain individuals all over the world do that, we find that there are other individuals who make a different choice. A choice that at the moment looks like it is absolutely foolish and ridiculous. Because you see, they are sealed by the Father. They have the Father's name in their forehead. Now that doesn't look at the time as a very good choice, does it? That's if you're looking by sight. If you're looking at what you can see, people would tell someone, you can't do that. I know you believe this way or you believe that way, but you've got to go along. You can't survive otherwise. Well, brethren, what will collapse and fall? And those who have made a choice that appears at the moment as a very foolish choice. Because you see, they have chosen to trust the unseen living God as opposed to a great system that holds dominance of tremendous magnitude and power. They have chosen a different path. They have made the same choice that Moses chose. We're told in Hebrews 11 that Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He esteemed reproach for Christ greater riches than all of the treasures of Egypt. God was more real to Moses than all of the wealth and the pomp and the grandeur and the glory of Egypt. And Moses made his choice on the basis of what was real to him. And so must all of us, because we're confronted with choices right now today. You don't have to wait until these prophetic events come. But if we think it's hard to make the right choice today, you think it's going to be easier in a time of tremendous pressure? We read in Matthew 24 about things, and we read about a time coming of all of these events occurring, and we read of a time when people will hate one another and betray one another. It's easy to read the Bible and look at the things carnal people did and think, boy, if I'd been there, I sure wouldn't have done that. I'd been one of the good guys. I wouldn't have been one of the murmurers, one of the complainers. I wouldn't have been the ones bowing the knee to Baal. I wouldn't have done the things that these folks did. I wouldn't have been one of those Israelites out there griping and complaining. Now, if you read the story, you find out they'd run out of water. They were in the middle of the desert and they'd run out of water. I've been in the Church of God for over 30 years, and I have heard an awful lot of people complain about a whole lot less than being stuck in the middle of the desert without any water. Well, we read that event and we say how carnal those people were. I'm certainly too spiritual to have ever murmured at a time like that. If I were in the middle of the Sinai and had no food and water, I certainly would have had no complaint about the man who had led me there. Well, of course, God led them there, the pillar of fire and the cloud. You read through the Bible, brethren, it describes our human nature. Now, the point that I'm making is that if we think it's hard to make, if we look at this, if we think it's hard to make right choices today, it's not going to get easier to make right choices as the pressures increase. We are living at a time when events are going to occur that are going to absolutely pass the bounds of all kinds of things that you and I could even imagine. Now, people have always been confronted by choices. There's an interesting account in the Bible recorded back. We're going to notice a couple of things in the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. Because I'm going to call your attention to two individuals that you may not at first glance think of as necessarily relevant to this story. Two individuals that you and I probably have not necessarily thought of as contemporary or thought of as having a lot in common. But they were two individuals that had a remarkable amount in common. In fact, you could call their stories the story of two Nazarites. The stories of two Nazarites, two men who were both under a Nazarite vow. Two men whose births occurred under miraculous circumstances. There was a supernatural, miraculous event surrounding their birth. Individuals who were chosen by God for a purpose, for a job. Individuals who responded in different ways. Individuals who took, well, I guess you could say the hard way. One took the hard way and one took the easy way to learn the lessons that God wanted them to learn and to fulfill the calling God had for them. Now, the two individuals to whom I refer are Samson and Samuel. If you put the story together, you will find that they were exact contemporaries. I don't want to go into all of the details, but I would just we pick up the story of Samson in Judges 13, and back in Judges 11:26, we find a reference to the fact that at the beginning of the judgeship of Jephthah, Israel had been dwelling in the land of Canaan for 300 years. Now, we would date the Exodus roughly at 1443 and the entrance into the land at 1403. You may vary those dates 2 or 3 years one way or the other, but I think that's certainly within a couple of years. 1403 was the time when Israel entered into the land. 300 years later brings you down to 1103. Now, as you figure the story in terms of King Saul, we know that Solomon's reign, there are several ways to date it. Solomon's reign would end at about somewhere in the late, in the 920s, let's say around 921, 922. If you come back, he reigned 40 years. That would bring you back to around 961 or 962. David had reigned 40 years. That would bring you back to let's say, about 1000 BC or 1001 when David came to the throne. Saul, we're told, reigned 40 years. So now we're back to 1041. So what we find, if just with a little bit of math, is the beginning of Jephthah's reign was about 1103, and Saul came to power about 1041. So you're looking at a period of about 60 years between this period of the book of Judges and the time when Saul came to power. Now, what we find in Judges 13, that Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and God delivered them into the hands of the Philistines 40 years. There was a 40-year period that we will see when this ends. Actually, in the book of Samuel, Samuel played a role in ending this 40-year period of Philistine dominance. Israel had done evil, and God delivered them into the hands of the Philistines. Now, there were two events that occurred around this time. One was a miraculous event described right here in Judges 13. An angel appeared to a man of the tribe of Dan and told him that he and his wife would have a son. And we find that the woman bore a son, verse 24, and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Eternal blessed him. And the Spirit of the Eternal began to move him at times in the camp of Dan. Now, we find that instructions had been given of this individual, Judges 13:7. The child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb of the day to the day of his death. He was no razor was to come upon him. He was to be a Nazarite. And God performed a miracle. He miraculously announced the birth of this child. And we find that this child grew up to be a man endowed with supernatural strength. Now, the Philistines had taken power and controlled and dominated Israel for 20 years. And in fact, we find that Samson, Judges 15:20, judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. His judgeship was during the time of this 40 years. In fact, I think as we'll see, it was the last 20 years because the Philistines took power. He was born, grew up, let's say, to about age 20, and then began to exercise this role and judged Israel for this 20 years, which concluded with his death. Now, with that in mind, we're going to come back a little more to the story of Samson. Let's go forward to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel. We read in 1 Samuel about a certain man and his wife who had gone up to Shiloh, to the tabernacle of God, there to worship before God. And the wife, Hannah, he had two wives, but Hannah was the one that was his favorite, and she had had no children. And we read the story of Hannah coming there to the tabernacle to pray and to beseech God for a child. And she really cried out to God, and she vowed a vow, 1 Samuel 1:11. Eternal of hosts, if you will look on the affliction of your handmaid and remember me and not forget your handmaid, but will give unto your handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Eternal all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. He was to be a Nazirite from his mother's womb. Now, Eli, at first, as he saw her here, and she was very emotional, and he saw her, the first thing, he jumped to the conclusion that she was drunk. And then when he talked to her, he realized that was not the case at all. And he told her that she could go, that God would give her a son. God would give her a child. And that child was named Samson. Now we read the story here in 1 Samuel that at the time Samuel was about 20 years of age. The Philistines captured the Ark of Israel. And we're told that within a matter of a few months the ark came back. And in 1 Samuel 7 verse 2, that while the ark abode in Kirjath Jearim, it was 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And as you go on through chapter 7, we find in verse 13, the Philistines were subdued at the end of this 20-year period and came no more into the coast of Israel. This is the end of the 40 years. So what we have to conclude as you put the story together is Samson and Samuel were born at roughly the same time. They were Nazirites from their mother's womb. There were miraculous circumstances involved in their birth. God intervened to give both mothers each child. Now, you know there could be hardly more contrasting characters in the Bible than Samson and Samuel. You see, they were confronted with choices, and they were confronted with choices at times of great pressure. And they exercised those choices, and they learned the lessons God had for them. And brethren, God has lessons for every one of us to learn. The choice we have is, are we going to learn our lessons the easy way, or are we going to learn them the hard way? Samuel learned his one way, and Samson learned his another. Now, God has choices that we're confronted with because we have, as free moral agents, as human beings, we have the ability to make choices. We have the ability to choose day by day. In fact, that's part of the whole process of internalizing God's law into our hearts and minds. God's law is written in our hearts and minds. We learn, as Hebrews tells us, we learn to discern, to make a choice, a distinction between good and evil. You see, we exercise our senses as we face life's experiences. It's one thing to read the book, and that's important. But you know, that's theoretical knowledge. I remember years ago as a student, I certainly read and studied the Bible, read the book of Proverbs, and knew all kinds of things about child rearing, marriage. I was single, hadn't gotten married yet, didn't have any children. I got married and came out into the field, and I knew what the book said. And the principles contained here are very valid, but I'll tell you, once I had children, I realized that I didn't know as much as what I thought I had known. Because you see, I was confronted with having to learn how to apply these principles in day-to-day circumstances, making choices. We can go through and read the Ten Commandments and have them memorized. That's great. But you see, day in and day out, you and I confront circumstances. And we respond to those circumstances. And in the process of responding to those circumstances, we are applying or not applying the principles right here that we read and we study. Now, I fully believe, as I look at the Scriptures, the fact that God is going to shake this world. God is going to do some very mighty things before the end of this age. You know, we're told in Daniel chapter 11 that the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Well, you know, the starting of that verse isn't exploits. You know, I'm ready to go out and do the exploits. Well, in order to do the exploits, you've got to have strength. I'm ready to be strong. Well, wait a minute. Who's going to be strong to do exploits? Those who know their God. See, that's the starting point. The proud, the doubting, the self-indulgent are not going to be used of God in great miraculous displays such as are described in the book of Acts. The humble, the trusting, the deeply dedicated and committed are the only ones that God can use in that way. And you see, we don't start out that way, so we have to move from doubt to trust, from doubt to faith. We have to move from pride to humility. We have to move from being self-indulgent to having the love of God. That's what conversion is all about, and it is a very painful process. It's a painful process because what it winds up cutting away from us is something that is near and dear. It's a part of our nature. You know, there are reasons why God compares conversion to circumcision. Circumcision of the heart. Well, there are probably a lot of reasons, and I'm not going to try to go into all of them, but I would submit that one thing that both processes have in common is they are painful. Circumcision of the heart is a painful process because it cuts away some things that are a part of us, a part of our very nature. Now, when we look at the story of Samson, he grew up, certainly with a knowledge of his destiny. We find that Samson was a self-indulgent young man. Judges 14:1 tells us he went down to Timnath and he saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he went back and told his parents, he said, I've seen this Philistine woman and I want you to go get her for me to marry. And his father and mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of your brethren, among your people, that you want to take? Now this gives you the impression this is not the first time Samson had become enamored of a Philistine woman. Is there never a woman among your own people? They were very disappointed. Samson said in the end of verse 3, Get her for me. That's what he told his dad. Very respectful, you understand. Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Or, literally, the watchword of the book of Judges, she's right in my eyes. You get her for me. She's the one I want. You sort of get the idea. Samson was a little bit self-indulgent. Well, we're going to see he was a little more than that. Now, they didn't know that it was of the Lord. What was of the Lord? Was God picking out the perfect wife for Samson so he would have a happy marriage and set a good example in Israel? Oh, no. No, you've turned out, and you don't have to get to the end of the chapter before you find out a little bit about the kind of person this woman was. But you see, what you find as you go through the story of Samson, God had raised Samson up supernaturally, endowed him to do a work to drive out the Philistines and to deliver the people of God. And yet you find the only time Samson ever lifted up his hands against the Philistines was when he got mad at them. When somehow they upset him. And in a fit of personal pique, he was ready to go do something. Well, you know, God can use people to accomplish His ends even when their motives aren't what they ought to be. But God was working with Samson as well. And Samson used Samson in spite of himself, and then he dealt with Samson to teach him some lessons. So the story goes on, and Samson marries the woman, and it's not long before he has marriage trouble, and he leaves and separates, and within a short time, he got mad and left, and then after he had cooled off and he came back, he found out she'd already taken up with another man. This is the story in Judges 15. Verse 1, came to pass within a while after, in the time of the wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife. He said, I'll go into my wife. When her father wouldn't let him, he said, and so now he finds out, well, now look, I don't want to make you mad, but, she's taken up with this other guy. Well, Samson was mad. And so he caught 300 foxes and tied their tails together and put firebrands between them and turned them loose in the wheat fields of the Philistines. Boy, he was going to show them. Well, you come on down through the story. Then we find a little later, in chapter 16, verse 1, Samson went up to Gaza, and he saw there a harlot, and went into her. So we find that Samson hasn't really learned anything from the other situation. We find a little bit of a lifestyle. Now, again, problems come along. In verse 4, it came to pass afterward he loved Delilah. Delilah. We remember Delilah. Now, Samson may have been the strongest man in the world, but he wasn't the smartest. In fact, in some ways, you could say not only he was both the strongest and the weakest. Now, he went into Delilah, and you see the Philistines didn't know how to overpower Samson. He had this incredible supernatural strength. And so, after he had taken up with Delilah, Delilah began to entice him and say, tell me the secret of your strength. Well, Samson made up this tale that he told her as it comes on down in verse 7 of chapter 16, he told her she would take these green strips and would tie him up that he wouldn't be able to break them. Well, they made arrangements for someone to lie in wait, verse 9, to come get him. And so then, you know what happened? Samson went to sleep, and she said, Samson, Samson, the Philistines are on you. Well, he jumped up, and of course he broke the bonds that tied him. Well, Delilah said, verse 10, you've mocked me, and you've told me lies. I want you to tell me the truth. Now, she's already deceived him once and had Philistines lying in wait to get him. She tied him up that way. See, she tried it to see if it worked. Now she's upset and says, well, you didn't tell me the truth. And Samson says, well, if you take new ropes that have never been used for anything before and tie me up, then I won't be able to break loose. Guess what? Next time he went to sleep, she did it. Now, you don't have to be a genius to begin to sort of have it dawn on you. This is not really the person you want to be telling secrets to, right? How long would it take someone to figure out this is probably not a real trustworthy person? Someone that I can confide my innermost thoughts to. Well, now, of course, he broke the new ropes. And then, verse 13, she said, well, you've mocked me, you've told me lies, and she was all upset. So he made up another tale. If you weave my hair together with 7 locks. So, of course, what did she do? Next time he went to sleep, she weaved his hair together. Well, verse 16, it came to pass, because that didn't work either. Came to pass when she pressed him daily with her words, urged him, his soul was vexed. And so he told her the truth. Said, I'm a Nazirite. That's why my hair and beard are uncut. If they were shaved off, I would be just like anyone else. Now, should it come as a shock, he's told her three tall tales, and she's carried through on each one of them. Should it come as a shock that when he told her the truth, she carried through on that? Well, of course she did. And you know the story. Samson, when he awoke out of sleep, verse 20, said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself. He didn't know that God was departed from him. The Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass. And he did grind in the prison house. Samson, the great, powerful judge of Israel, the miraculous son that had been born to Manoah of the tribe of Dan. A man who was a Nazirite, set apart as holy to God from his birth. But you see, Samson didn't accomplish much in his life. Oh, he did a little bit here and there. But in so many ways, his life was wasted because he was filled with pride, with self-indulgence. And he did what was convenient for him to do. And his focus was on himself. Now, Samson was taken and was hitched to a post to turn a great grinding wheel and to grind grain. He was hitched up like an animal. Prior to that, of course, his eyes had been gouged out. And so now here is Samson, blind, walking around in a circle, day after day after day. I think it could be said that Samson probably saw more after he was blind than he had ever seen in his lifetime. Samson certainly went through a period of what could be termed great tribulation, as he was here a captive, a blind captive. But you see, in reality, he had been blind before. He had been blind spiritually to really see the purpose of his life and the whole point of what God was after. It's interesting that the final stage of the Church of God is characterized by blindness. But in the context of this time, as Samson had time over a period of months, we're told his hair began to grow out again, so we know time went by. He must have thought and contemplated so many times the wasted, empty, futile life that he had led. And he finally had one final opportunity. The Philistines brought him into the temple to mock him. And he prayed and he asked God that God would empower him with strength one final time. And he said in verse 30 of Judges 16, he said, "Let me die with the Philistines. I don't ask you for life to go on beyond this. I have wasted what you have given me. But give me in my death an opportunity to accomplish what I was never able and willing to do in my life." We're told, the end of verse 30, the dead that were slain at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. He judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. He accomplished more in the final moments of his life than he had ever accomplished in 20 years. Samson was confronted with choices, and he made wrong choices that took him in a road of pride and self-indulgence. And God finally knocked him down to humble him and to bring him to a point of really seeing himself. Now it's interesting because Samuel makes an interesting contrast. Samuel came as a young child, perhaps 6 or so, to live at the tabernacle. Elderly Eli was the high priest. Eli had 2 grown sons, and he had been indulgent to his sons, and they were corrupt. The Bible calls them sons of Belial. They were absolutely corrupt. They had no real reverence and awe of God. And the example they set brought the priesthood into reproach with the people. We're told that they lay with the women virtually in the shadow of the tabernacle. They were corrupt. Now, Samuel grew up surrounded by these individuals. He grew up with a knowledge of the truth, but he grew up seeing that just knowing the truth and doing the truth were 2 different things. But Samuel made some right choices. And from childhood, God began to use him because Samuel was humble and was yielded to God. And God began to use him in a remarkable way. And we're told, as you come on down through the, in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel in verse 19, Samuel grew. The Lord was with him and did let none of his words fall to the ground. All Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. And the Eternal appeared again in Shiloh. He revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. People could see that boy is different. You just watch. He's going to grow up. God's going to use him. You can see he's different than those priests around there. Well, as you go through the story in chapter 4, you read the capture of the ark, which I think must have occurred about the time of the beginning of Samson's judgeship. And we find that God worked things out to get the ark back. And in chapter 7, 20 years, verse 2, 20 years have gone by, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And Samuel spoke to them now, 1 Samuel 7:3, "If you do return to the Lord with all your hearts, then put away your strange gods and prepare your hearts." He said, if you want God to deliver you, you've got to turn to Him with all your heart. And so we find that the Philistines, verse 13, were subdued and came no more into the coast of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. God used Samuel. Samuel was yielded to God. Now, Samuel went through his life and he faced his tests. But you see, Samuel made some choices that prove to make for an easier path than Samson. We are confronted with choices, and we're going to be confronted with increasing pressures as the events unfold in the world around us. Brethren, God tells us in Romans 9:28, He will finish the work. He will cut it short in righteousness, for a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. That's the end of the story. The choice you and I have to make is not whether or not God will finish what He plans on finishing. The choice you and I have to make is how will we be used of God individually. We must make that choice. Now, we can take the pathway of Samson, or we can take the pathway of Samuel. We can learn our lessons the hard way or the easy way. That choice is a choice you and I are confronted with in our lives. But God, the God that we serve, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, the great God who inhabits eternity, who walks upon the wings of the wind, the great God, the heaven is His throne, the earth is His footstool. God says, with whom will I dwell? With him that is humble and of a contrite spirit, that trembles at my word. God is going to work great works. But you know, He resists the proud and gives more grace to the humble. It takes the power of God, the gifts of God, the grace of God, to accomplish the job that God has set out. The job that God will accomplish. He is going to finish the work. He is going to cut it short in righteousness. He is going to make a short work upon the earth. Brethren, we must be yielded to God in our hearts and in our minds as God roots out the pride, the fear, the self-indulgence. Humanly we're fearful. We try to protect ourselves. God is the only source of protection. Those who try to protect themselves are going to make some wrong choices, we read in Revelation 13. They're going to seek to protect themselves. They're going to make decisions on what they see. Those who trust their God are going to make decisions for which they will be eternally thankful. God has called us and given us an opportunity to serve Him. An opportunity to be a part of His family on into eternity. An opportunity to be used of Him as a part of doing His very work upon this earth. And yet, brethren, you and I, as we see what's happening in the world around us, we have to realize that all of us are confronted with choices in our lives. And it's far easier at this point to make right choices than to have to learn the consequences of wrong choices in the years that lie ahead.